1840. That is the number I want you to hold in your mind. Not an era, not a rough historical window. One exact year. Because in that single year, three major powers, the United States, Britain, and France, all pushed toward Antarctica almost at the same time. On the surface, that sounds reasonable. It was the age of exploration. Naval science was advancing. Maps were still unfinished. And every empire wanted its name attached to the last unknown places on Earth. At first, I accepted that explanation. Then I found a line buried in a footnote connected to an expedition record that had clearly been edited before reaching the public. Just one sentence, quiet and clinical, but impossible to ignore. Formations inconsistent with any natural process known. That was the first crack. The second came 50 years later, when a survivor from the first expedition to overwinter in Antarctica gave an account claiming his crew had seen cities beneath the ice. Not mountains, not shadows, cities. Stranger still, that section was not translated into English for 60 years. That was when coincidence stopped feeling convincing. Because maybe Antarctica was not just a place people rushed to explore. Maybe it was a place where something was seen, then buried. If this mystery came from only one expedition, it would be easy to dismiss. A confused witness, a damaged journal, a story exaggerated over time. But that is not what the record shows. The deeper I went, the more the same pattern appeared in three separate national archives. First came Charles Wilkes, the American line. He sailed in 1838 at the head of a squadron of 6 ships, mapped more than 1,500 miles of Antarctic coastline, and returned in 1842. On paper, that should have made his legacy secure. Instead, his own officers challenged parts of his report, not because it was too bold, but because it felt incomplete. Certain mapped features were hard to explain. The official log did not always match what sailors described in private letters and personal papers. After returning home, Wilkes faced repeated court-martial proceedings. His career slowed inside bureaucracy, and his journals were heavily edited before publication. Then there was Dumont d'Urville, the French line. He departed in 1837 with official goals that sounded straightforward enough. Push farther south, plant the flag, serve science. He returned in 1840 and was celebrated, with a daily land carrying his mark into history. Then, in 1842, he, his wife, and his son died in the Versailles train disaster. Many papers believed to be with him disappeared as well. Tragedy does not prove conspiracy. Accidents happen, but some details deserve to be remembered. And then James Clark Ross, the British line, the most respected of the three. He identified the Ross ice shelf and described an immense frozen barrier that seemed impossible to cross. His published account was calm, exact, and unmistakably Victorian in tone. But rough journal material points to phrases missing from the official version. Mentions of geometric anomalies and stone formations described as strangely structured. 3 men, 3 nations, 3 real achievements. And in every case, a record that does not feel whole. Up to this point, the mystery could still be contained. Strange formations, incomplete reports, odd language buried in edited records. Unsettling, yes, but still explainable as confusion, exaggeration, or the limitations of 19th century exploration. Then Carsten Borchgrevink enters the story, and the scale changes. In 1895, he was part of one of the first groups confirmed to set foot on the Antarctic continent itself. That alone made him important. But it was his return in 1898, leading the Southern Cross expedition, that matters here most. His team became the first to deliberately overwinter in Antarctica. They were no longer passing observers along the coast. They stayed. They watched. They endured. And that is exactly where the record becomes strangely narrow. The official reports are detailed when it comes to cold, isolation, biological samples, weather measurements, survival conditions. They read like careful scientific documentation. But when the subject turns inland, to stone, exposed ground, and the wind-stripped zones where ice had been swept away, the precision fades. The language becomes vague, almost evasive. Then there is Nikolai Hansen, the expedition's zoologist, dead at just 29. In the official record, his death is acknowledged briefly, then absorbed into the general hardship of the mission. History moves on too quickly. And then there is the silence. One surviving member spoke only once in any meaningful public way, in a Norwegian newspaper interview from 1903. The most important passage was not translated into English for 60 years. When it finally was, it described what can only be called a kind of geographic fixation. The crew believed they were looking at something arranged beneath the ice, something structured, something that should not have been there. Borchgrevink's own private letters deepen the unease. He is exact when writing about supplies, animals, and logistics. But when he approaches certain landscapes, his tone shifts. It becomes abstract, poetic, unfinished, in at least 3 places. A sentence describing rock simply stops and the subject changes without warning. That is the moment this stops being about unusual terrain, because now the possibility is no longer that they saw something strange. It is that they saw something built. At this point, the simplest defense of the official story is obvious. Antarctica is not entirely buried beneath uninterrupted ice. There are exposed rock zones, the nunataks, where wind, pressure, freezing, and erosion can produce shapes that look strange to human eyes. Flat faces, sharp lines, fractured surfaces. Science already has language for that. Columnar basalt, frost wedging, differential erosion. I took those explanations seriously, because they deserve to be taken seriously. And if this mystery were based on one isolated report, that might be enough to settle it. But that is not where the problem is. The real anomaly is not the shape of a single stone. It is the distribution. Across different expeditions, from different nations, across locations separated by hundreds of miles, the descriptions begin to repeat with uncomfortable precision. Regular angles, repeated geometric intervals, stone arrangements, unlike natural weathering. One account even described rock that did not break the way stone breaks. That phrase stayed with me, because it points to something deeper than visual oddity. Not just form, but behavior. Not just appearance, but pattern. That is where the standard explanation begins to thin out. Natural geology can produce surprising structures, but when similar descriptions keep appearing across separate routes, separate observers, separate years, and separate coastlines, the question changes. We are no longer dealing with a curious outcrop or a dramatic formation. We are looking at recurring anomalies that appear clustered, almost as if they belong to a wider layout. And that is the disturbing part. When the reported locations are mentally overlaid, they do not feel random. They begin to suggest concentration, grouping, maybe even intentional placement. Not the remains of one structure, not one broken wall or one unusual ridge. Something larger, something distributed. So no, the mystery is not that a few explorers saw strange rocks. The mystery is that too many of them, in too many places, describe the same kind of strangeness. And once that becomes visible, the ground under the official explanation starts to shift. Up to this point, the mystery could still be framed as human error. Strange rocks, harsh conditions, exhausted men projecting order onto unfamiliar terrain. That explanation is imperfect, but it exists. What is harder to explain is what happened after the expeditions came home. If natural geology, overextended exploration, and occasional visual distortion were enough to account for everything, then why did 3 separate governments react in such similar ways to the same category of information? Why the editing, the delay, the disputes, the incomplete release? In the American case, Charles Wilkes's full mapping record did not move cleanly into public view. Portions were delayed for years. Some materials were effectively reclassified through administrative handling, and parts of the personal record appear to have been revised before wider circulation. In Britain, the Admiralty received Ross's complete logs, yet a significant body of officer material was not publicly catalogued until the 20th century. That delay, by itself, might mean nothing, but the pattern matters. In France, D'Urville published his account, but later, historians pointed to recurring differences between the printed version and crew journals. Again, the changes do not cluster around weather, biology, or navigation. They cluster around stone, inland form, and surface features of the continent itself. That is the hinge of the entire question. Why rock? Why do the omissions gather around geology, terrain, and what was seen on land? And why would 3 competing nations, with no obvious reason to coordinate, all produce the same kind of silence? To dismiss this as coincidence, you have to accept something remarkably unlikely. You have to believe that rival governments independently decided that Antarctic geology was somehow too sensitive to document clearly, and then failed to leave any convincing official explanation for doing so. That is possible. But there is another possibility. Not that they planned together, but that they encountered the same kind of information and arrived at the same institutional response. Reduce it, delay it, dispute it, blur it before it hardens into public record. And if that is true, then the silence tells us as much as the sightings ever could. Maybe the explorers were not the only ones disturbed by what lay on the continent. Maybe their superiors were, too. At this point, I need to be careful about the line between what can be shown and what can only be pointed toward. Some things in this story can be documented. Delayed records, edited logs, repeated descriptions of unusual stone formations, institutional silence across rival governments. Those are real patterns in the archive. But beyond that lies a wider body of material, one that historians of architecture, geographers, and researchers of cartographic anomalies have been circling for years. It raises a possibility that official history never fully welcomes, that before the world as we think we know it, there may have existed a civilization operating on a global scale, and that more of its memory was erased than we are ever told. This is where the old maps enter, the Peary Race map, the Arance Fine map, others like them, maps created long before Antarctica was officially recognized, yet seeming to show parts of its coastline with unsettling precision. In some interpretations, they appear to depict not just the continent, but a version of it with far less ice. The orthodox response is familiar. These maps, we are told, were copied from older source material. Perhaps those earlier sources came from lost navigators, fragmentary records, or traditions no longer preserved. But notice what that explanation quietly admits. If the maps truly derive from older knowledge, then someone possessed geographical information about Antarctica before its official discovery. That does not solve the mystery. It deepens it. Who reached it? When? And why did the record of that knowledge vanish? Once that question is allowed, Antarctica changes shape in the story. It is no longer just a frozen frontier where strange things were glimpsed by 19th century explorers. It becomes one leak in a much larger system of forgetting. And if there really was a civilization with global reach, one capable of surviving extreme environments and leaving traces in stone, then the real question is no longer whether Antarctica was ever inhabited. It becomes something colder than that. When did it stop being inhabited? And who made sure the memory of that world disappeared with it? By now, it would be easy to say that this story is about records, about maps, journals, edited reports, missing passages, delayed translations, and institutional silence. But that is only part of it. The deeper truth is harder to sit with. This is also a story about what Antarctica seems to do to the people who go there. Again and again, polar history records the same human toll: extreme stress, isolation, sensory distortion, sleep disruption, hallucinations, what some later writers would call polar madness. Men at the edge of the world, trapped inside cold and light and distance, so overwhelming that the mind begins to lose its grip on scale, on time, sometimes even on reality itself. And yes, once that is admitted, a more reasonable explanation comes into view. Maybe the walls were not walls. Maybe the towers were not towers. Maybe the cities beneath the ice were only the product of fatigue, mirage effects, oxygen deprivation, shifting light, or the atmospheric distortions known to produce impossible-looking forms across frozen horizons. Antarctica offers no shortage of natural mechanisms for deception. Fata Morgana can stretch objects into vertical structures. Ice glare can reorganize depth. Snow and exposed rock can produce patterns that resemble design when the brain is desperate for order. I do not dismiss any of that. In fact, I think any serious investigation has to begin there. It has to admit that explorers were vulnerable, frightened, physically damaged, and often operating in conditions that could easily turn uncertainty into vision. But even after allowing for all of that, one thing continues to disturb me: the consistency. If these had only been random hallucinations, I would expect random imagery. I would expect fantasy, chaos, religious visions, ghosts, childhood memories, castles in the sky, impossible creatures, private symbols born from stress. But that is not what keeps surfacing in the margins of these records. Instead, The descriptions bend toward the same cluster of features over and over again. Massive scale, stone, non-European form, planned arrangement, long linear divisions, walls, district-like layouts, segments of something larger, as if only the uppermost edges of an immense buried system were visible through breaks in the ice. That is what makes this harder to release, because the pattern is not dreamlike in the way hallucinations usually are. It is structured, repeated, spatial. It sounds less like fantasy and more like partial observation, as though different people, at different times, caught incomplete glimpses of the same hidden thing. And then there is the letter. Not a famous one, not widely discussed. Just a private letter from an officer describing what he believed was a chain of walls extending along a cliff face, too regular to be called natural, too deliberate to be comfortably written off as weathering. According to the surviving account, he reported it to his commander and was instructed to remove the observation from his personal log. He complied there, but he did not remove it from the letter he sent to his younger brother. Decades later, that letter was donated to an archive in 1974. It was cited only once, in a single academic article published in a small journal that disappeared within 2 years. Maybe that means nothing. Small journals die all the time. Archival fragments vanish into obscurity every day. But in a case like this, even the ordinary has begun to feel loaded. And that is why I keep coming back not to any single dramatic detail, but to the pattern as a whole. Not one strange geological formation, not one death, not one hallucination, not one edited report, not one impossible map, but geology, maps, cut passages, private letters, unexplained deaths, institutional caution, repeated visual anomalies, and the same empty spaces in the historical record, all leaning in the same direction. That does not automatically prove a cinematic conspiracy. Maybe there was never a room full of officials deciding to erase the truth. Maybe it was something quieter than that, something more human, and in a way, more believable. A truth so destabilizing that every institution encountering it responded the same way without needing to coordinate. Reduce it, reframe it, delay it, file it under stress, delusion, bad weather, optical confusion, and let time do the rest. That may be all a cover-up really is when the thing being covered is too large to integrate into the world as it exists. So no, I am not claiming certainty. I am not telling you that I know exactly what lies beneath the Antarctic ice. I'm not saying every witness was reliable, every map authentic, or every gap intentional. I'm saying something smaller, and to me, more unsettling. It feels as if a door was closed here, closed carefully, quietly, not slammed shut, but pressed into place with enough patience that later generations would mistake it for a wall. And yet the seams remain. In the maps, in the letters, in the edited logs, in the strange regularity of the stone, in the people who came back unable or unwilling to fully say what they thought they had seen. So I leave you with the questions that refuse to leave me. What did they see? Why did silence gather so quickly around it? Why do old maps seem to know what history says no one knew? And what, exactly, is still down there beneath the ice? Maybe Antarctica is only empty because emptiness is the safest story we know how to tell about it.